Greetings everyone, my name is Garnet Schulhauser and I am a Level 2 QHHT practitioner. QHHT is short for Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique, which is a hypnosis modality developed and perfected by Dolores Cannon over a period of many years. Now in a QHHT session, the client is induced into a very deep hypnotic trance called the theta level. Now there are two parts to a QHHT trance. In the first part, the client is taken back to one or more past lives chosen for them by their higher self. And the second part is the practitioner will make direct contact with the client's higher self. The higher self will channel through the client to answer the questions that the client has brought with them to the session. You can obtain more information about QHHT and what it can do for you on my website, which is Garnet Schulhauser, QHHT.com. And if you're inclined, you can also book an appointment for a QHHT or a BQH session directly on my website. Now, before we get into the serious topic for today, I'd like to relay a funny story I heard recently. It's a woman and her husband arrive at the dentist's office. The woman says to the dentist, "We need a tooth pulled in a hurry, and don't worry about Novocaine because we don't have time for that." And the dentist says, "Okay, which tooth do you want pulled?" And the woman pushes her husband forward towards the dentist and says, "Go ahead, dear, show him which tooth." Now the topic for today is to disclose a very fascinating previous life that one of my clients had in a QHHT session. So it seems that when the client came off the cloud, he found himself, and this client was a young man, he found himself standing at the edge of a crowd of people gathered in a town square. And he said that he was wearing a waistcoat and breeches, dressed much like the other men in the crowd, and he sensed that he was in 18th century England. The crowd had gathered to watch the hanging of a man who had been caught picking pockets of people in the square a few days before. The people in the crowd were engrossed in watching what was going on at the gallows. They watched as the prisoner was marched up the steps and positioned over the trapdoor and a noose placed around his neck. But my client was not there to watch what was going on in the gallows because he too was a pickpocket. As the crowd was totally engrossed in the happenings at the gallows, my client was slipping in amongst them, helping himself to wallets, money bags, and other valuables from the people in the crowd who did not notice him at all. My client was very skilled at what he did. He had done this many times before, so he was basically a professional pickpocket. When he had finished picking all the pockets that he could easily get to, he decided to leave the square. At this point, nobody had noticed him or what he had done. Right at the edge of the square, though, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He was spun around, and there he was face to face with the town constable, who immediately whacked him over the head with his club, knocking him out cold. My client later woke up in a dark, cold cell with no windows. He could not tell how long he'd been there because he couldn't see the passage of light and darkness as the days went by. He figured it was maybe a couple of days when suddenly his cell door opened. The constable came in, dragged him out, and took him to the gallows. They marched him up the stairs and positioned him over the trapdoor with a noose around his neck, just as they had done to the fellow who had been hung there a few days before. My client said that he was not really frightened or upset because just before he had left his cell, he had been visited by one of his spirit guides. The spirit guide was dressed in shining armor like a knight from medieval times. His spirit guide gave him great comfort and assurance that he would not end his existence when he was killed in the gallows, but he would leave and go on to live another day because he was an eternal soul. So my client, who wasn't really religious, but he got a lot of comfort from his spirit guide. And so as he was walking to the gallows and up the steps, his spirit guide was walking beside him. except only my client could see him, no one else could. So he's standing there above the trapdoor with the noose around his neck, and just before they released the trapdoor, he left his body and was hovering above the gallows watching what was going on. Well, the trapdoor released, his body dropped down, and when it reached the end of the rope, his body jerked and spasmed and twitched a few times before it went silent as he took his last breath. But my client was not concerned about this. He recognized that his body was just his physical vehicle for his journey on earth. He did not feel any pain or discomfort when his body reached the end of the rope, and he was actually feeling a great sense of peace and security in his position there where he was hovering above the gallows. And beside him, of course, was his spirit guide, who took him by the hand and led him up through the clouds on their way to the spirit side. As my client was floating up towards the cloud, he said he had no regrets about that life. He said that he had grown up in an orphanage and he had no family, and so no one would miss him. And so his life had ended quite abruptly, but there was no one around there to shed any tears for him, and he was okay with that. But when he came out of the trance, my client said that that was really quite an amazing past life that he'd experienced. And he said that he now knew why he really hated wearing shirts with tight collars, because that was a residual memory of the noose tightening over his neck in that life that he had just saw. So that was sort of a residual spillover from that past life. Very interesting past life, and I can assure you that not everyone has a past life like that. Most people have fairly innocuous and mundane past lives. But in these videos, I try to relate to you some of the more interesting stories that my clients have experienced during their past life regression. Well, that's all for now, folks. Thank you for watching. Enjoy your journey, and remember to keep on dancing.